Thank you, Jen. I hope you can see me. We're still all trying to get used to Zoom conferences. Very good morning to all of you, and a good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. As Jen has said, I'm David Chan, Professor of Psychology from the Singapore Management University. I also wear many hats, which we can talk about some of these, depending on the nature of the interactions we might have later. But let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to address you at this global conference on data science, and also to share with you, of course, on issues concerning public trust. I understand that we have a diverse audience here, and many of you, I assume, would like to get an overview of the issues involved in the trust process. So what I'll do in 30 minutes that I'll have, I won't take all 30 minutes. I will keep my remarks short, general and non-technical, instead of giving an academic lecture, which I guess most of you have sat through quite a few this morning. So here we go. I think there'll be no slides for you today, no notes, just an informal sharing with you on the science and practice of public trust. And then I look forward to responding to some questions that you might have, which you can also type them, I understand, briefly into the Q&A box anytime during the session. First, let's begin with the basic goal I think that many of us here have as researchers or practitioners in the data sciences, or as policymakers and leaders in organizations that I'm sure some of you are at this conference today. What is that basic goal? I think it's really to gain insights from the large amounts of data that we have, the data that are often disparate, often dynamic, and very different in formats and so on. And the goal then is really to discover knowledge about some phenomena, right? To gain insights, discover the knowledge, and then try with that better understanding to make predictions, to make recommendations, make decisions that's going to affect people's lives in important ways. And now we all know that the data come from various areas, right? Areas that you are very familiar with, I'm sure, in the data sciences. We talk about the social media, we talk about any online communication, digital transactions, or any spatial temporal information that we might have through sensors and various kinds of, say, visual analytics and so on. And then, of course, there's artificial intelligence. There is the big data analytics of different sorts in the different sectors, be it public, private, or people sector. I think what we have seen is how these technological innovations, these technological applications in these areas, they have actually transformed the ways that governments or businesses or organizations and individuals, the way they operate, the way they deliver their services. But I think what is important is that this transformation in turn has really significantly affected and will continue to affect people's lives, livelihoods, the way of life, and also the quality of life. And we also know that these technological effects are very important because they translate into practical impact on people's well-being, people's functioning at various levels, right? Be it at the individual, the group, the organization, or the society. So my point here is really this, that given all these impact, right, it is quite clear that we really need to be trustworthy. And that's why we have the KDD Day today on trust. I'm sure that's what the organizations have in mind when you plan this a special day for this conference in data sciences. But let's take a step back. I think researchers and technical practitioners, like most of you are in data sciences, I think we tend to think about trust in very operational terms. So what do? We try to increase the reliability, we try to increase the validity of our measurement. The purpose really is to enhance the accuracy of the inferences that we make from the data. And this could include the technical trustworthiness, right, of the techniques that we use, the technologies that we use, the models that we use, the systems that we use, and so on. I think my role here is really to just remind all of us that there's really much more to trustworthiness and public trust than the technical and operational issues that we in data scientists spend a lot of time in. Now, if you think about the context of research, the context of public policy, or the context of practice in organizations, it's quite clear, I think all of us know that you can apply your data sciences effectively only if there is high public trust, right? As you interface or as you interact with the people who are actually providers of the data or people who are users of the data, such as making their daily decisions or making big important society decisions like policymakers and leaders. Just take, for example, the COVID crisis management, right, in which the leaders' actions, leaders' words, leaders' decisions, they need to be highly trusted by the public in order for things to work. Trust was very critical in problem solving in the crisis. Trust is still critical, especially in crisis moments, because a baseline level of trust, right? I think is foundational for people to decide to believe their leaders, decide to cooperate, decide to perform actions towards achieving the intended outcome. Now, when your trust is low, we all know that your effective functioning is hampered. That sounds like a motherhood statement, but in practice, do we really know that enough, and do we actually apply that into our daily decisions and lives? If you look at our leaders of any country or any city, and you look at leaders in the businesses, leaders in the non-profit organizations, they can tell you that it is very difficult when there is no trust or low trust to implement any control measure during the crisis or during any other major incidents, to initiate an initiative to sort of change a decision that you have already made, and now you, because of various in the light of new information, you need to make changes, and people think about it as making a U-turn. People thinking about I've done something and yet you're going to change what you have promised and so on. And how are you going to then explain that change? How then you're going to galvanize people to try to collectively move towards a particular action because the information has changed? That is something that I think all of us as leaders, or all of us as researchers or policymakers face all the time. Now, what the research in social and behavioral sciences have told us is very clear, and that is it consistently showed us that the trust in leaders is very difficult to build, but it is easily eroded, and once it is lost, it is very difficult to restore. I should also add another important social psychological findings that some of you might not be so aware. Right, leaders are also human beings, and the research has shown that the leaders are susceptible to the same human biases of overconfidence and the low self-awareness. What that really means is that many leaders not only actually think that they are better than they actually are, right? They not only think that they are better than they actually are, they also overestimate the degree to which their followers perceive their trustworthiness. So that is very important. However capable you are, or you think you are, remember to bring it down a little bit. That's what people think your capability levels. And when you think the people trust you, bring it down a little bit. That is the actual levels that people actually trust you, right? That's what the research has shown us. So I think what we need is really an evidence-based approach to build trust. For those of us, all of us here, I think in data sciences of one sort or the other, to take a step back and recognize that whatever we do, we have to understand how humans think, how humans feel, and how humans act in the very context of the issues that they care about. And when we know that, then it can help prevent your trust erosion. You can repair any trust violation. You can enhance trust development. But for that to happen, of course, we need some humility, some objectivity, perhaps some learning orientation, right? To learn, draw some lessons on trust from the research that we already know. In the case of Singapore, the COVID crisis actually has taught us, right? We know that, but it has really taught us and brought back home how important public trust is. And we did well in certain things. We didn't do so well in others. I wouldn't have time to go through the COVID-19 crisis, but I've written a book on the psychology of a response to COVID crisis. Those of you who are interested can take a look at my school's webpage. And by the way, in my CV, there'll be various links to videos and articles that you can take a look, be it on trust or other issues. So what I want to do is really to, because of time, to contextualize trust for you, right? And to do that, I think we need to define the specific issue at hand. What is the situation? What is the time period? And a very useful framework, I thought, at least I think so, to think about trust is in terms of what I call the 3 M's. 3 M's of trust matters. And that is to look at trust as a multi-level. That's the first M. As a multi-dimensional. That's the second M. And also that trust is malleable, right? That's the third M. So let me very quickly go through these 3 M's with you. First, trust is multi-level. And by multi-level, it really means that there are different aspects of trust at different levels, from individuals to group to organizations or institutions. And it's quite important to distinguish those levels because we tend to talk about trust as if it's a homogeneous construct. We tend to use the word trust very loosely, right? But when we know, recognize which level of trust that we are talking about, and then things become much clearer. Now, first, of course, there is the individual level, and that is fundamental, right? Because trust is really essentially a psychological construct. It is really about the perception of trust that really matters. Now, what we need to recognize is that a leader may have all the capabilities, all the information. Actually, a leader could be objectively trustworthy on an issue. But you do not perceive that the leader is trustworthy. Why? Well, because there could be other factors, right? Such as poor communication, poor coordination, and that has could negatively affect the perception of the leader's trustworthiness. So it is important to separate the objective trustworthiness, which we all need to strive towards, but that's quite different from the subjective perception of whether a leader is trustworthy or not. And that level of trust, of course, is important, because when you don't trust the leader, it affects not only how you feel, how you think, but it affects the particular actions that you might do, which may be contrary to what the leader would try to influence you to do. There is, of course, also the trust at the group level, right? And what is it about this group level? And some of the things that we might not be so used to, perhaps need to remind ourselves. Now, if I ask you this question, do you trust the national leaders in your country? Or do you trust the national leaders in your country? Now, when you're answering this question, I think you are thinking of the leaders as a team, right? And as an abstract trustee, so to speak. You are not necessarily thinking about a particular individual leader, but it may just take one individual leader in the team to behave in a certain way to increase or decrease your trust for the leadership as a team, right? So at the group level, it is quite important that while you are looking at a group or a team, just one individual in the team could actually affect how your perception of the team and so on. And this applies, of course, not just to national leaders. It applies to the CEOs, right? It applies to a senior management team in an organization. It just takes one individual in the senior management team to affect our perception of the entire senior management team. In the case of Singapore, we don't only talk about trust at the group level. I'm sure in other cities as well, we focus a lot on intergroup trust. And that is something I think we may not have given enough thought, right, in our data sciences. In Singapore, for example, we are very used to talk about social harmony, social cohesion of trust between groups, right? And often we talk about different race groups or ethnicity, different religious groups and so on. But like many other cities, I'm sure, and countries, Singapore now finds itself having to pay attention to a lot of emergent group differences, right? Such as a trust between different segments of the population, right? Between locals and foreigners within a very cosmopolitan city or country. There could be other emergent groups that we should be concerned with, right? That are categorized according to demographics, be it age, socioeconomic classes. And I would venture to say even groups between people who have different roles, right? Do we have trust between, say, the scientists and the policymakers? And COVID, this was very clear in many cities. Scientists say one thing, policymakers say another, but it's not just vis-a-vis the public. It's also about the intergroup trust between these two groups of people. We can go on and on, talk about groups in terms of values and so on, but I won't have time to do that. Now, most of us are more familiar with trust at the institutional level, right? When we talk about public trust. In Singapore, if you talk about public trust, everybody says, oh, it is about trust in the government and so on. And that's important because it is very clear who the specific trustee is, right? That's the government, or that could be the public institutions such as the enforcement agencies and so on. People who hold on to your data, and privacy is an issue of trust, for example. But while the trustee is quite clear who that you are directing the trust towards, I think what is less clear is the various dimensions of trust, right? And that leads me to the second M, right? And that is trust is actually multidimensional. By multidimensional, we have to look at the dimensions for both parties, right? In the trust relationship, the truster, the person that is trusting, and the trustee, the person that's trying to get your trust. Let's talk about a dimension, say, about beliefs, right? Now, if you are a citizen, your propensity to actually trust your government is very much affected by your personal beliefs, your perceptions about the government. As I've said, right, this is a subjective, but it is very important because it is sometimes independent of the government's objective trustworthiness, right? Because the government might have a trustworthiness that might not be evident to the citizen for various reasons, such as as a citizen, you might not have the relevant information. You also may not have an idea of what is going on because of poor government, public communications, coordinations, and so on. And that happens in many, I would say, all countries and all cities. Of course, we all know now that people could also very easily misinterpret some facts or some data, or you could be misled by others, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and assume that some factual inaccuracies or falsehoods are actually the truth. So you can be objectively trustworthy as a leader, but subjectively the person's people that is you're trying to get the trust might not think so. But I think that disconnect is something again that we need to realize. And of course, people come with various expectations and so on. But let me just very quickly talk about three dimensions of trust that in all my writings and in the entire literature across various disciplines always talk about. In fact, some time ago, I've done a literature review on literature in 17 disciplines, and we find that across the disciplines, people focus on these three important dimensions of trust. Right? So just a reminder that trust is really not homogeneous. First, trust, there is about trust in competence, right? That's something that you and I are very familiar with. And this is the perception of whether your leader or the professional or the researcher, whether they actually have the ability to solve the problems that you care about. In the case of governments, of course, this trust dimension in competence probably refer to whether they could solve problems that affect your lives, right? It could be things related to infrastructure, the digital society, public transport, delivery of services, and so on. Then the second dimension of trust that we all care about is trust in integrity. So you often talk about not just competence, but you talk about character, right? And that's the perception of whether the leader, the person that you're dealing with is honest, is incorrupt, is impartial, and so on. That's important because integrity involves your perception of the person's character, and character often drives a lot of things. I just want to say that it is not possible to have a perfect character. It doesn't mean that when you breach integrity at one point and you forever will not be trusted, right? So in Singapore, for example, we are very careful on how we handle people who have done some wrongdoing, right? It is quite well known in Singapore that it doesn't matter who you are. Once you have done something wrong and it is quite clear there is evidence, the government and in fact the various parts of society will expect enforcement of a vigorous action. And that's important because that to some extent could reinforce the position of zero tolerance for wrongdoings, and that could help you to enhance trust in integrity. The last dimension of trust that I just want to talk about because of time is trust in benevolence. This is a bit difficult in the sense that we are not used to thinking about trust beyond character and beyond competence, right? Benevolence is not about integrity per se. Benevolence is this public confidence that the leader is authentic, right? In other words, do you say what you mean and do you mean what you say? Do you have good intentions? Do you have good motivations when you are making a policy decision or when you're undertaking a particular action and so on? This trust in benevolence is very important because when people believe that you are doing something out of your own interest rather than motivated by a genuine concern for people who you are trying to serve, then this trust in benevolence gets eroded. And when it gets eroded, it is really very difficult to bring it back. And that's something I think that we need to realize, right? That it is a very hard, a very difficult form of trust to gain. This trust in benevolence, do you mean what you say? Do you say what you mean, right? It means a lot to the public, means a lot to the followers, but it is often, research has shown, to be neglected by leaders. So all of us who are leaders here do remember that it's not just about your competence, your integrity. You need to mean what you say, and what you say, you say what you mean, and you must be perceived as such. Because when you are perceived as not sincere, a lot of things just doesn't work. Let me just go to the last dimension of trust, and that is trust is malleable. This is the idea that most of you are probably quite aware. It just simply means that trust levels can change. It seems very obvious, but we often fail to, I think, appreciate its implication, right? When we think about trust as being dynamic and the fact that trust can change. What that really means is that trust takes time to build. It is very easy to lose. It is once lost, very difficult to restore. But the point here is not to talk about how fragile trust is and we lament about it. The point here is really to appreciate the dynamics of trust, right? And what does it really mean when we say trust can change? So what is it about changes in trust over time that we all have to bear in mind, right? In all our research or our policy making and so on. First, I would argue that trust is very dynamic and sensitive to the context, right? A level of trust at any point in time, we must not take it for granted, because the level of trust can change gradually, but it can also change abruptly. It may increase or decrease, not just gradually. It can actually increase very quickly or decrease very rapidly, depending on the prevailing factors that impact trust. And then you get a pattern or trajectory of trust over time, which of course, as scientists, we can model, we can analyze, and so on. But what that really means for leaders and for those of us who are supporting leaders in various advisors and so on. And that is very difficult to predict actually future levels of trust based on the historical trends of trust. Now, we all know about the various kinds of trust barometers, trust surveys, and so on. Now, they are not useless, they are relevant. But I just want to make all of us think that, it is possible that you have trusted your government, whichever country you are from, for the past 20 years. But then they did something that really violates your values, and then you will stop trusting it, right? What that really means is that the trust need not change gradually, and the historical trends, the trends analysis that you try to do, it may not be very useful. So whenever we try to project trust, think about the trends as something just a relevant piece of data that you have. What is really more important is to think about the prevailing factors and so on. And what will happen next year depend very much on what you as a leader do this year, right? Rather than what you have done in the past 5 years in terms of trends and so on. So with that, right, I just want to maybe pause here and take some questions. But for those of you who are interested in the science of trust, the practice of trust, you could take a look at some of my writings, some of my talks, which are in videos that I mentioned that you can access on my webpage, and try to think about addressing trust in various ways. I'm a member of the Singapore's Social Science Research Council, and I'm also a scientific advisor to A*STAR, that's the Singapore's National Agency for Science, Technology and Research. And one of the things that we try to do is to bring social behavioral sciences together with people in the more technical computing technologies and social sciences, because we actually have the same problems, right, that we are dealing with when you talk about the issues of trust. And it's quite important, therefore, to understand what research has already told us about trust, what it is not, how you're going to access the various dimensions of trust, be it competence, be it integrity, be it benevolence, and so on. What is it about low trust? What is it about distrust and high trust? What is it about mistrust, right? That's trusting people when you should not. How do you monitor the different levels, different dynamics, and all these are possible research questions that we can do together. But in order to do that, we have to get some kind of a framework, some kind of understanding. Don't reinvent the wheel, right? There's basically like 50 years of research on trust that you can get from various disciplines, and we should actually borrow from those works to try to understand how trust can erode, how you prevent the erosion, and when there's a trust violation, then how do you repair it? How do you rebuild it? How do you develop the trust? And then so that we can all create the trust climate that we all need for the data sciences to be applied effectively, right? In order to realize the data society, which has so much promise. And in order to do that, recognize that your trust is not random, but neither is it predetermined. And to some extent, we can influence it. And so that trust, while it is fragile, trust is also very powerful. And I think with that, we can work together, whether you are a researcher, whether from any discipline, whether you are a policymaker, or whether you are a practitioner, right? It is really quite possible to develop and emerge stronger as we apply our data sciences to change society for the better. I think that is enough for my time. I am doing okay. I still have 5 to 10 minutes for questions. If I can pass it back to Jen and to take any questions that you might have.